Hey everyone, my name is Ryan Floyd. I'm the founder and managing director at Storm Ventures. We're a venture firm right here in the middle of Silicon Valley, and we invest in early stage enterprise and B2B SaaS companies. This is a series of video blogs aimed at giving founders and executives the same kind of advice I might give you if I was on your board or an advisor or an investor in your company. I've been slow to put out any new videos of late because of the current pandemic. And I know it's an incredibly difficult time for so many out there, but I wanted to begin to share some of my thoughts about what it's like as a venture investor, how I'm thinking about it, as well as some additional videos around the sort of advice we're giving companies and how we're thinking about this more broadly in the business context. So anyway, I hope you enjoy it. If you do, please hit subscribe and be sure to leave me some comments. So in this series, I want to talk about what it's like being a venture investor. But before I get into that, I just want to say I hope you all are safe. It looks like we're going to be sheltering in place here for quite a while, and the recovery seems like it may take quite a bit of time. It's really anybody's guess. But just on a personal note, I do know how hard this is for so many people out there, and my thoughts are with you, and I hope there's a bit that you can get out of these videos that can help you through all of this and with your business. So for us as a venture investor, I think there's some things that might be obvious to some, and maybe some things that are not obvious. And the reason I wanted to share my thoughts about it as a venture investor is because I think it's important for anyone thinking about fundraising to understand the mindset of investors right now. And obviously this is just my opinion, but I'm pretty confident I probably represent the perspective of many others. So, when I think all of this happened, my first priority really was, outside of my family, that was the team at Storm, and how to transition to really working remote. And while in some ways as a venture fund, we're in better shape than others because we do spend a lot of our time outside the office meeting entrepreneurs and working with portfolio companies, we certainly have an office culture at Storm. We have lunches every Monday together. We spend days having companies present to us, and our work life certainly revolves around the office. And so it has been a transition for us. And trying to get used to it, all the Zoom calls and the Zoom happy hours on Friday, and I think we're making it work. We're getting to be pros on Slack, but I do understand how hard that is for so many. It's much more challenging than I think a lot of people represent, and we've struggled with it as a firm. The second thing to mention is we've spent a lot of time talking to our investors, the people who entrust us with their money to invest on their behalf, and letting them know kind of what we're thinking right now about the portfolio, letting them know where we see risk, letting them know how we're thinking about investing going forward, helping them plan for capital calls, that is to say when we're going to call their capital, because some of our LPs, which stands for limited partners, need to be more thoughtful now about their forecasting when they need to be able to meet capital call requirements, given that many of the other assets in their fund and in their portfolio are worth far less today than they were 30 days ago. So we've been spending a lot of time with LPs on the phone and walking them through all that, and also getting their advice about what they're hearing from other managers, and making sure we're not missing anything, or thinking about things perhaps far differently than others are. And we've had to make a lot of changes. We were planning our LP meeting in May, and no big surprise, we canceled that weeks ago, and are adjusting, and hopefully we'll get to do that perhaps in the fall. But we may end up spending a lot of time virtually and doing things over Zoom calls and email. By far the most amount of my time in the last few weeks has been spending it with the portfolio. There's some of our companies that are doing incredibly well right now, that happen to be building products that help with remote work. We have a company, Splashtop, that helps companies access servers and laptops remotely, and it's become a very popular product, no surprise. And companies like TalkDesk that help companies that are trying to transition to call centers in the cloud. And today, with the inability really to stand up physical call centers and have employees work, that ability to really be distributed and service your customers is even more important, and that's certainly benefited TalkDesk as well. But most of our companies are challenged, like I'm sure many of you are, that were caught off guard, as we all were, with this. And we're trying to figure out what to do going forward with respect to expenses. But really what I think everyone is really focused on, outside of the very obvious things around cash conservation, which I will put together a video in terms of very specific advice and things we're thinking about on that, because it's there's a lot to get into there in terms of how companies are thinking about this. But it's really trying to predict what the next couple of quarters are going to look like. Because while we can really, control our expenses to some degree, the unknowns around revenue at this point are just tremendous. It's like nothing I've ever faced in my career, because it's very hard to predict what's going to happen, and that obviously has a big impact on cash and how we might think about expense control. Many of our companies have already started to take actions this week around furloughs and layoffs and salary reductions and foregoing bonuses and just a lot of hard work and sacrifice to try and match up with what they think they're going to need to do to survive to the other side of all this. The biggest challenge I think everyone's facing is cash, and thinking about whether or not there will be any additional investment for these companies, because the challenge in venture for most of our companies is that they're all on a path to go out of business because everyone is unprofitable. So in some point in time, they need to raise money. I mean, that is the venture model. So, we're really trying to think through, is that investment even going to be available? In prior downturns, it became incredibly challenging to raise money. 2008, 2009, when that crash happened, it was a good 6 to 9 months, even for the best companies, to be able to raise money. And the crash back in 2000 to 2002, in that period after 9/11, right after I'd started Storm, it was just a wasteland. It was incredibly difficult to raise money. We really had to figure out ways to help our companies through the desert, and some were able to make it, and some unfortunately weren't. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about that right now. The reason I mention that is because I think it leads me to my next point around investing. I think a lot of people are wondering, are venture investors going to be investing in new companies, and how are we thinking about that? And that's really the meat of what I wanted to really talk about. Because I think as an entrepreneur, you're trying to think about, if you have to raise money for your company, are there even going to be venture investors out there that are going to be willing to open up their checkbooks and back you? The answer, probably not surprisingly, is it's complicated and it depends. I think most venture investors are reeling right now and are spending a tremendous amount of time on their portfolio. So I think right now, as we're sort of still kind of in free fall, it's probably very difficult to raise money, and I probably wouldn't even spend time trying to do it right now. I think it'd be okay to try and have conversations, but I think most venture investors' focus is on their existing portfolio and doing what they can to help kind of think through strategy and next steps. So as we move into late spring, early summer, I'm sure activity will pick back up again. I can speak for a Storm standpoint. We have quite a bit of money to invest. I think when my partners and I think back to prior downturns, I think a mistake we probably made was that we were not aggressive enough about new investments and making new investments, as it's easy, the psychology of a downturn to keep you kind of sitting on the sidelines. And so we are actively this time trying to go out and source and look for new opportunities. But with that having been said, I think there's some challenges, and so the reason you see a lot of venture investors saying, hey, we're open for business, want to be investing, yet at the same time you hear people talking about things are going to slow down. That's what I kind of want to reconcile for you. And One of the basic challenges, stating the obvious, as I'm sitting here in my new office in my dining room in my house, is that everything is done over Zoom, and making investments without meeting people in person will be a first for virtually everyone. Now, I'm sure there's some funds out there that have written checks without having ever met the founders. In fact, we made an investment in a company called Gather years ago that was based in Atlanta without having ever met the founders in person. But we did it over Zoom. But in that case, we happen to have known some people that knew the founders quite well, and so we were able to feel comfortable taking that risk. But I'd say by and large, you can imagine that presents an obstacle for many to sort of get used to and get comfortable with doing that. So that's going to slow things down. I just mentioned I'm spending a lot of time with my portfolio right now. I'm sure that's true of virtually every single venture investor. And as a result, they just don't have as much time to be looking at new opportunities. Whereas I might have been spending, half my time looking at new opportunities, 45 days ago, maybe I have 10% of my time now to do that. And so that's going to slow everything down and impact everyone. I think there's a lot of unknowns now in terms of, what is the world going to look like post-pandemic? And, is spending going to resume? And, what are potentially the right investments in the right areas to be investing in going forward? So I think that's going to take venture investors some time to really kind of think through and develop a thesis around it. I mean, the way to sort of think about it is we were all firing on all pistons, 30 days ago, 45 days ago, and now we're having to really rethink what that strategy is going forward. In Storm's case, we're still big believers in B2B, SaaS, enterprise SaaS. We're not doing anything dramatic in terms of a shift, but we are sort of rethinking categories and burn rates and what we ought to expect in terms of revenues. Even looking at companies today it's a different eye. We used to look for growth opportunities, but to expect growth going into Q2, Q3 of this year is probably not realistic. But they could still be great companies in many cases. So all of that takes just a lot to think through. Despite the fact that there's plentiful capital, whether it's with Storm or with others on the sideline that does want to invest. And I don't think venture investors are looking to, get some great deal and take advantage of entrepreneurs and reset valuations, although there may be some slight reset on valuations. I actually don't think that's likely to occur. I think there's so much money out there to invest in great ideas that we probably won't see huge valuation changes. We may see some, time will tell. But I think it's more, I think what entrepreneurs ought to do right now is you really ought to be preparing for the long haul and know that there's a lot of competing interests right now on behalf of investors that, they have to, perhaps set priorities a bit differently than they did 30 days ago. So I encourage you to continue to have those conversations. I'd certainly like to have them with folks that sort of are a good match for Storm, but at the same time, I tell you that it probably will take a bit longer, and to be patient with the process too, because we're all trying to figure out a path forward onto the other side. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed getting this perspective of how a venture investor at least is thinking about this. Please leave me your comments, and I will do my best to respond to them. And if you have any other suggestions of things you'd like to hear me comment on, please leave those as well. I always like hearing from everybody, and I will put together a few additional videos on advice we're giving to portfolios and maybe a little bit more of how I think about how we'll come out the other side of this. But until then, be well, be safe, and thanks again for watching.